is in the house. Hello, Mr. Ari.
Okay, good morning, everybody. We have discussed on many occasions different minhagim, how they evolved. Sometimes there's a halachic basis for it, sometimes there isn't, and very often minhagim develop a life of their own. But most of the time, there is some halachic basis for a minhag. And there are many, many different types of minhagim. Pesach especially is full of minhagim, different customs, depending where you come from. We talked last time about soft matzahs versus hard matzahs. The minhag, or the halacha now actually, of not eating kitniot on Pesach. It's a halacha among most Ashkenazic Jews. Sephardic Jews don't follow that particular practice. So I want to analyze what kitniot are, what they aren't, and what the ramifications are for us. First of all, make it very, very clear. The word kitniot, in English, is translated as legume. A legume is any vegetable that has nitrogenous nodules on the roots. So on the roots, that's the technical definition. Bees, peas, things of that sort. Nuts, certain types of nuts, certain types of, again, seeds, rice, corn, sunflower seeds, sesame seeds, peas, lentils. These are all legumes. And the minhag has come down to us. Again, it's a difference between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. We'll talk about that. Not to eat kitniot on Pesach. I want to make it very, very clear that kitniot by themselves are not chametz. Very important to understand. Kitniot are not chametz. Underscore that. They're not chametz. So if you happen to go to a Sephardic house during Pesach, you may not want to eat the peas or beans or corn or rice, but there's no worry, there's no chash that it might be chametz, and you can certainly eat on their dishes. So for that, get that out of the way. Chametz is defined as water coming in contact with 5 types of grain: oat, wheat, rye, barley, spelt. Those are the 5 grains that can become chametz. Anything made from these grains with water becomes chametz. Ashkenazim do not eat kitniot for a very simple reason. Because there are 2 reasons, actually. Reason number 1 is that very often in the ancient world, where they would store different grains, the regular grain and the legumes would be stored in proximity to each other. And again, in the ancient world, they weren't that particular about storage facilities. So very often grains would get mixed together. So you're worried that that might be a kernel of wheat among the rice. Today, for example, in a continuation of that minhag, in Syrian communities especially, before Pesach, you will see the usually older Syrian women put a black cloth on a table and spill all the rice on the black cloth, and then go through each kernel of rice to make sure there's no wheat kernels mixed in with. They still do that today. They would check the rice to make sure that there's no wheat kernels or any other grain kernels mixed in with it, because they were stored together. There's another reason. When I teach history in the Middle Ages, so we talk about the 3-field process of farming. Farmers, again, this is reminiscent of Shemitah, to a certain extent, of letting the field lie fallow, farmers would divide their fields into three. And every year they would only plant 2 out of 3 of those fields. And the third field would lie fallow. But because they were limiting themselves to 2 out of 3 fields, very often the proximity of the peas, beans, rice, corn, etc., to the wheat and the other grains would be very, very close. And they would be mixed together very often. So because of that, the minhag arose not to eat kitnios because they were growing up in the same field, or they may be left over on the year that you wouldn't plant in this field. Some of the stalks might come back up. Whatever the mixing up of the grains, that's the basic reason. Whether it's because they were stored together or they were planted together, this is the custom that grew up in the Sephardic countries. The farming perhaps was different, and the minhag arose. In the Sephardic countries, they would eat kitnios. As I said, it's not chametz. In the Ashkenazic countries, they would be very careful about this. Yemenites also eat kitniots, although some don't eat certain types of kitniots, hulse, for example. But chametz can only occur with those 5 grains that are mixed with water and are allowed to stand. You can eat, for example, I mean, technically, we don't, but you can eat whole beans, raw beans. If you eat beans or peas, raw beans or peas or other you can eat, technically. But again, we're very careful not to. It's interesting that Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, one of the former chief rabbis of Israel, observed that in the early Yishuv, before the students of the Vilna Gaon and the Baal Shem Tov made Aliyat. By the way, this is the only time that the Hasidim and Misnagdim agree. But before they began to come in the second wave, the second Aliyah in the 18th century, Ashkenazim in Yerushalayim would eat kitniyot. But then again, fresh legumes anyway. They only prohibited dry legumes. But once the European rabbis and students came in the second Aliyah in the 18th century, they brought with them the prohibition against kitniyot. I will say that today there is this, I wouldn't call it a machlokas necessarily. We eat it because of a minhag. We know it's not chametz, but our minhag is not to eat kitniyot. The conservative movement and many Jews in Israel, in 1989, the first tshuva came out from the conservative rabbis that it was okay to eat kitniyot on Pesach, and some conservative Jews do that. It's interesting. In the 1930s, Maxwell House, the famous Maxwell House Haggadah, they hired an advertising firm to market their product to the Jewish community. And they hired a rabbi to research coffee to determine that a coffee bean is more like a berry than a bean, and therefore it is not kitniyot, and therefore it's kosher for Passover. Little footnote history of the Maxwell House coffee. So this minhag began in the Middle Ages, in all probability, and then it flourished throughout Europe in the Ashkenazic period. The Rambam allows kitniyot during Pesach, and even certain Amoraim in the Gemara in Bavel allowed eating kitniyot because, again, they're not chametz. But again, the farming practices in Babylonia may have kept them separately. So the 3-field system was primarily in Ashkenazic Europe, and that's the minhag carried over to today. Okay, it's interesting that in the Gemara, fascinating Gemara in Pesachim, Mem Amud Beis, the Reish Galusa had a cook, and she would cook a certain dish called chasisi. I don't know what kind of grain it was, but it could easily be confused with chametz. And Rava objected to it. Says, how could the Reish Galusa have somebody cook for him something that looks like chametz? Maybe it was like an oatmeal type of thing. It looked like oatmeal, but it was a type of kitnios because it didn't look nice. Chasisi was defined as a lentil, like a lentil soup. And according to the Vilna Gaon, this is the basis for our minhag of not eating kitnios. It goes all the way back to the Gemara, according to the Gra. Okay. Again, some communities go back earlier time to the ancient Greeks and Romans. Kitniot are also considered to be the food of mourners. When you come back from the cemetery, the first thing they would give a meal would be a meal of lentils, which is round. Today, somehow the minhag evolved to give a person a bagel instead of a lentil when you come back from the cemetery. But the round shape of the beans, the cycle of life, and so forth, so it became associated with mourning, and it's another reason. So Pesach is a holiday of Simcha, so that's another reason why we do that. The Yerushalmi, interesting, has an experiment to determine if something can become chametz, but we don't know exactly what that process was. So the minhag in Eretz Yisrael, where the Yerushalmi was based, eventually, because of this particular test, forbid kitniyot. And this minhag from Eretz Yisrael, at the time of the Mishnah, carried through to Ashkenazi Jewry, which supports one of my theories. I have a theory, which is not held by most historians, that the minhagim and the practices of Ashkenazic Jewry in the early periods directly came from the time of the Mishnah and Eretz Yisrael. Because you understand, when the temple was destroyed, large boatloads of Jews were taken as prisoners to Rome. Now, they were redeemed, Pidyot Shvuyim, but from Italy, they went to France and then Germany and spread throughout Europe. So many minhagim, and also following that line of thought, the Ashkenazic pronunciation of Hebrew, even though it might sound grating to the modern ear, was probably the way Hebrew was pronounced in Israel in the time of the Mishnah. And the Sephardic pronunciation of Hebrew was a shift from the Babylonian to the Spanish pronunciation of certain letters until it came to the Sephardic world in its current form. But in my way of thinking, the correct pronunciation is Ashkenazis as opposed to Sfardit, which, and I say most people don't agree with, but sequentially, you could see a lot of things that came from the time of the Mishnah were transferred directly into France and Germany in the high period of the Balei Tosfos and so forth. Yeah.
Where did the O's and the Y's come from?
Okay, the O's and the, it's interesting, the O's and the Y's. Rav Schwab, has a wonderful sefer on the Siddur. And in his introduction, he criticizes those who pronounced Hebrew, Burich, because that's not Hebrew, he says. He criticizes them in very strong language. This is not Hebrew. And it probably came about, I guess, based on the language that the country that you were in, whether it was Polish or Russian or Hungarian, whatever the language may have been, that kind of got transferred over into how people pronounced Hebrew. It's not Hebrew. And it's grating on the ear when somebody does that. But again, minhagim are very strange. If you spell minhag backwards, what do you get? Gehenna. I've often told my favorite story about minhag. I'll repeat it again. I've said it many times before. There was this little shtetl in Europe, and they built a lovely wooden synagogue. But the Jews weren't the greatest architects, And after they built this lovely little wooden synagogue, it settled a few feet into the ground, which meant the 6 foot tall doorway was now 5 feet. So everybody who went into the shul had to bend to get in the door. Once you were inside, you were fine, but they had to bend. Years go by, and they rebuild the synagogue with cement, and it's properly done and a good foundation, and with an 8 foot tall door, and everybody goes to shul, bends down as you walk into the door, because that's how they were doing it for generations.
Sounds like hell.
Well, it's not like hell, but it's a reality that once people start doing something, the original reason for it gets lost in the mists of the past, and people don't know how to, they aren't always aware of where these things came from. Okay, there are a number of, again, there are so many minhagim that are problematic in terms of contemporary Jewish life. In Israel, the general minhag is that they eat kitniot, and you have hechsherim kosher lePesach kitniot. Sounds like a duplication in language. You have, again, in Sephardic communities, in most of Israel, they eat kitniot. You have hechsherim on kitnios for Pesach. It is not our Ashkenazi custom to do so, but there are many customs that are in a contemporary world problematic. Yontif Sheni, the second day of Yontif, you're in Israel. Even if you're not in Israel anymore, we know what the calendar is. Why do we still have Yontif Sheni? And the Gemara dealt with this question, and the answer is minhag avoseinu b'yodenu. Once you have an established minhag, you can't just change it just like that, even though conditions may have changed. What if in the future the calendar gets forgotten and we don't know how to do it? So we still keep second day of Yontif. I know I have a grandson right now because of what's going on in Israel. So I think there are only 20 guys left in the yeshiva. Most of them found ways to get home for Pesach, and and the hotels are going to be empty. And he's looking around for a second day minyan. He's having trouble finding one because in many places they have a separate minhag to have a minyan for those who are outside of Eretz Yisrael for second day Yontif. Most people observe only one day, and there are shitos in halacha. The Chacham Tzvi, very famous posting, the father of Yaakov Emden, the Chacham Tzvi paskind that if you are in Israel, you only observe one day. Period. Some people follow. There are others, day and a half. But the point is, once you have an established minhag, it's not that easy to change it. Yes.
I remember you asking us this question a number of years ago. You know, Suffolk bracha l'kuba, like if you have a Suffolk and you have a bracha, so he says, where in the right do you have to now in the second night, at the second Seder, to make all those brachos? He said it should be a problem. So he said, the Chum dealt with this. They said, if we remove the brachos from the Seder within time, no one's going to make a Seder. So they said, even though that's the rule, but over here, we're overriding that rule.
Okay, fine. There are lots of rationalizations for why we do what we do. And I mean, there are some in Yontif Sheni. There are many people who don't eat gebruks. What are gebruks? Gebruks are matzah brai, for example, or knedlach. Using matzah meal or cake meal mixing with water, you're afraid there might be some unbaked piece of grain among the matzah meal or the cake meal that might become chametz when you mix it. So Hasidim especially don't eat knedlach, don't eat any cake made with matzah meal until the last day. On the last day, to show that it's only a minhag, not a halach. Which, in my unsophisticated mind, doesn't make any sense. Either it is, if you're worried something's become chametz, what difference does it make? I mean, the Vilna Gaon used to put knedlach in his window on Pesach to show the world. It's ridiculous. You can, and if again, the possibility of some of the matzah not being baked properly is so infinitesimal. Now, again, chametz is also b'mashu. The slightest bit of chametz will be, but the practicality of it is practically nil. I mean, if you ever been in a matzah factory or watched them making hand matzahs, they're rolled flat. There are no pockets. There is a real fear. Sometimes when you're making hand matzahs, sometimes the dough gets folded over. And there might be a possibility of something not getting baked. So you have to be very, very careful with the rolling pin, with the Valga that when you roll it out, it's totally flat and there's no bending or anything. But if it's totally flat.
If it didn't get baked, it's already chametz.
Huh?
If it didn't get baked, it's chametz.
Okay, but that's what they're worried about. They're worried that
you don't have to worry about the matzah. The
so
matzah
if you're looking for logic, if in fact there's a small bit of flour that wasn't baked, and by putting it in your soup, or making matzah braai, or making knelach, the same thing can be true with the matzah that you're eating. When you put it in your mouth, it comes in contact with moisture. If you're worried about, so again, minhagim don't always have to make sense, but as a wise teacher once corrected a student who said, this doesn't make sense, and he said, always add two words to that, to me, which is true. Doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand it. Is there a logical sense to it? Is it true? But this is so we are an amalgam of two things. We follow halacha and we follow family practices. If there are people who don't eat gebrok, they go to someone's. If somebody does eat gebrok, well, can you eat on his dishes on Pesach? What about your dishes on the last day? Well, the whole year. Play around with it. Yeah.
We have a concept, minhag hamakom kedin. So why, if I go to Israel, do I have to hold 2 days? And if an Israeli comes here, he gets away with 1
So
day.
first of all, the source of that practice, minhag kedin, is very, very questionable. Because certain minhagim are based on halacha, and certain minhagim are not. So you have to do the research to distinguish between them. Apparently, and I'm just trying to rational it out, at some point in the matzah baking process, at some point in Europe, they weren't either as careful or the process itself wasn't as sophisticated as it could have been, and there might have been a real concern. If you go to a matzah factory, or a hand matzah factory, or a bakery where they make hand matzahs, most of them, 99% of the matzahs come out flat. But every so often, when they flip over these pancakes to bake in the oven, it might get bent. So in most factories, they'll throw it out, because that could be a real problem of chametz. Other factories, they just break it up and they sell them as shvarim, the broken matzahs. But again, most minhagim have some basis in halacha. The minhag of gebrok at one time may have been legitimate. Today, it's simply a carryover from an earlier time, because the process of making matzahs today is much more sophisticated than it was 300 years ago. So yeah.
I'm going to be the guy that just says this question that comes up all the time. At one point or another, what they were doing was correct. And then at some point, some Rabbeim and other people said, this is no longer our minhag and we're going to change it. So I understand the concept of minhag Yisrael. I understand the concept that we have minhagim. But it seems just odd to me that we're basically just picking and choosing what we think based on the rabbi that says X, Y, and Z. At some point, everyone ate kitnios. Why is that a problem? Now it is. You have people who wait 6 hours, people who wait 3 hours, people who wait a half hour. Are any of them wrong in what they're doing? No. So why don't we wait 3 hours instead of? So I have an issue with the concept of, at some point, someone decided down the road that this is what you should be doing, and now our reasoning why we do everything is because this guy said all these years ago. Who are you to say that? Not to take away from that rabbi, but you understand what I'm saying? So
You're
conceptually,
100%.
I have a big problem with it.
You're not the only one. You're not the only one who has a problem with it. The only issue is when a minhag becomes established, regardless of how it started, it's very difficult to overturn that minhag since so many people all over the place are following that minhag. Like for example, I hate to bring an example from the conservative movement, but the Rabbinic Assembly issued a responsum based pretty much on what you're saying, that from now on you can eat kitnios because it's not really chametz, and it doesn't reflect our reality. And they issued this tshuva. I don't know how many conservative Jews follow that particular ruling, but that was a ruling that the conservative movement issued initially in the early 60s, 59, 60, somewhere around there, and it was renewed a number of years later. But once a minhag has been established in a certain family, people tend to forget why it was established. And even though there might be legitimate halachic bases for certain minhagim, once again, if you need somebody with very, very broad shoulders to say, from now on, we're all going to eat kitnios. It's not chametz. Now, if some great rabbi got together or a group of great rabbis said, in the year 2026, we have decided that kitnios is no longer an issue, and we're going to paskin that from now on you can eat kitnios. If there would be such rabbis to say that, I don't know if that minhag would be abolished, because once it's been so embedded in the fiber of our observance, it's very hard to change. It may not be a halachic basis anymore, but the notion, the same thing is true of second day of Yontif. There are many people, rightly or wrongly, who when they're in Israel for Yontif, don't observe the second day. I'm in Israel. What after? And there are poskim that would agree with them. So you're 100% correct in what you're saying, but as minhagim develop and grow, once they've been established, it's very, again, I'll give you one other example, and then I'll let Mendy ask his question. Al pi halacha. It's a classic example, one of my favorites. Al pi halacha, you are not allowed to ask for personal needs for people on Shabbos. You can't ask, you can't pray for somebody, for a person, because Shabbos is all praise to Hashem. No personal requests are on Shabbos. Shemon Esrei is different and so forth. Okay? And the Gemara specifically says that you don't pray for sick people on Shabbos. It's prohibited because you can't ask for personal petitions on Shabbos. Now, the Gemara, when discussing this, it talks about Nichem Avelim. So Nichem Avelim you also can't say on Shabbos. However, the Gemara says if you see an Avel, Tok Shiva, so you go over to him and say, the Shabbos he milahis nachem. If it weren't Shabbos, I mean menachem over. That's by Avelus, okay? Somebody along the line took that and said, aha, we could say, the Shabbos he melizok. Even though you're not allowed to pray for personal things on Shabbos, we're going to pray for refuah shlema for this cholah. And that's, you try to abolish Misha Berak for cholim in shuls on Shabbos. Try doing that and see what happens to you. To run you out of town on a rail. You can't do it. It's so entrenched. So minhagim, once they're established, have a life of all their own, even though it may not be correct halachically. If it's a gross violation of halakha, that's a different story. But here they have a foothold. The Shabbos himel nachem becomes the Shabbos himel lizo. That's not found in the Gemara. That came much, 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 much later, hundreds and hundreds of years later. But somebody figured out a way with the Gemara thumb to do it. Mendy, you got a question?
I think if you're a convert, right? I think you can pick any minute that you want. You want to wait an hour, you want to wait 3 hours, you want to wait 5.5 hours, you want to wait 6 hours. Pick whatever you want and anything. But if your grandfather and your father had a certain minute and you're saying, no, I think that's a real slap.
Well, again, sure. It's a slap in the face of your ancestors. And by the way, for a convert, living in a community, if you adopt whatever minhag you decide, you might be at odds with the rest of your community. So if you are a convert in a German community, then you'll probably decide to wait 3 hours.
In today's society, we have such a mixture.
Again, it depends where you live and where you daven and who your chevra is.
In most places, it's a mixture of people.
It is a mixture, no question about it. But people pick, the Schuster shul, the Schneider shul, people pick, yeah.
So, question, I'm clearly there's the difference between halacha and minhag, I get that. But you hear a lot, at least I do, how orthodoxy has gone more and more and more to the right, certainly compared to when I was a kid. And it's, as they say in Yiddish, other other name. It's like it is or it isn't. You've got minhag and you've got halacha. So what's pushing it to the right? All of a sudden, Rabbanim are finding these, huge halachas that weren't around when I was a kid, or are minhagim becoming almost like halacha?
Well, minhagim have always become almost like halacha. It's always been a factor. What's happened in the past 50 or 60 or 70 years is that more and more people are becoming better educated. And they're learning a lot more, and they're plumbing the sources the way people growing up in the 50s didn't. You didn't have that knowledge base. So the more knowledge that you have and the more sources that you're exposed to, then your understanding of halacha and halachic practices might shift. So the
So
minhag.
they still have chumras and kulas back then?
Of course they did, but people.
So you could have it here now, too.
People weren't always aware of it. The rabbi of the shul might have been aware of it. The average balabos was not. And the more you learn, the more you understand that there are halachic sources for certain minhagim, and there are certain minhagim that do not have a lot. Again, another one of my favorite stories. A fellow goes, he's a traveling salesman, and wherever he goes, he tries to find a shul for Shabbos. So he winds up in some community, and it was Shabbos Mevorchim, or somewhere, one of those Shabbosim. And so they come to Afarachimim. And one guy from the shul says, Mezok ya, this Shabbos we do say Afarachimim. And the other side says, Mezok nish, this Shabbos we don't say Afarachimim. And they start yelling and screaming at each other and fighting with each other. This guy said, what the heck is going on here? So he goes to the rabbi and says, I don't know what's happening. Explain this to me. In some places, the minhag is to say Avarachim the Shabbos. In some places, it's not the minhag. What's going on? The rabbi says, this is our minhag. They'll argue and fight over it. So there are minhag. As I say, a minhag has a life all of its own, whether it's based on a halachic source or not. Most of the time, the more people learn and the more people study and the more knowledgeable they become, they can sift between these things and determine which is a halachic practice and which is not. Pesach especially is prone to many, many different minhagim about the Seder. What do you use for karpas? What do you use for moror? How big is a kazayas? These are all halachic issues, but they're all based on family practice. In some homes, the person who's running the Seder will give out a little piece of matzah to each person to eat. In the yeshiva homes, in most places, they'll give out a gezunta piece of matzah because a kazayas is like a half of a hand matzah, a big amount. And if you look at the OU guide that just came out, they give you a tear of it. This is how big a kazayas is. Reb Chaim Volozhiner, a kazayas is smaller than this napkin. That's a kazayas, a little piece. Whereas everybody else says a kazayas, the kazonish. I know in our home, by the time we get the Shulchan Aruch, all we eat is the soup. Because after motzi matzah and after korech, you're full. How can you eat a meal afterwards if you had all that matzah? You can't. So the shiur of a kazayas, it's a halakhic requirement to have a kazayas. How big is a kazayas? And every year, my wife says, we got to measure this. This is ridiculous. Take an olive, the volume of an olive, and what size olive? Is it a big olive or a small olive? And you can buy 3 different sizes of olives in the store. What size olive is it? And if you ground it up, and again, look at the OU guide. There's a tear out piece there, tell you how big a kazayas is. And it's a big piece. Usually it's about half of a machine matzah. 3/4 of a machine matzah and half of a hand matzah is a kazayas. The chazon each is even bigger. But b'chaim v'loshin, small piece. So again, kitnios is not chametz. And what once may have been a reality of the grain, of the legumes getting mixed up. Now it's interesting, potatoes were not known in Eretz Yisrael. And when the potatoes first spread throughout Europe, is the potato kitniot or not? Can we eat potatoes and the same thing came up with green beans, depending where you came from and what was available agriculturally. So Pesach is full of different minhagim. Most Ashkenazic Jews, almost all Ashkenazic Jews, do not eat kitniot on Pesach, but it's not chametz. So you can go to a Sephardic house. Whether you should eat their kitniot is a separate issue. If they serve you a rice pilaf on Pesach, the minhag would say not to eat it. But if you did eat it, you haven't eaten chametz. As I said, the Vilna Gaon had Knei Lach, so it's good enough for me. Anything else? All right. Chag kosher v'sameach. Enjoy.
Thank you, Wally.
Shkoyach. Jonathan. Yep, we're good.
Yishem Adonai Baruch Me'atzah V'yad Olam. Baruch Shem Mishloach V'chayinu. Ki hu elzon from Nation Kol B'Tiv LaKol Michim Uzon B'Kol B'Jasav Asher Bara V'Regato Adonai Hazon Esakol. Yam Rizcha Shevasam. Just Baruch them. So Yachal. When you were nodding your head in agreement, that was my son that was talking.
It's okay.
He's
Kol
allowed.
hakavod.
Thank you all.
What was I just saying? Like the six things you like. Good for I like them.
What?
No, I want to get off of here.
Well, you have to close it.
Oh, you do, thank you.